Have you ever started a video and suddenly, boom, you're hooked? Did you know 90% of people leave in the first 15 seconds? But not you. What I'm about to share will change how you see this. Stay until the end for a bonus tip that makes all the difference. Comment where you're watching from, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's dive in. The night had settled heavily over Redwood Ranch, bringing with it a bitter cold that was unusual for this part of Texas. The vast, open land stretched for miles in every direction, the occasional silhouette of a mesquite tree casting eerie shadows under the pale moonlight. It was the kind of night where the wind howled through the fields, rattling the wooden fences and causing the horses to shift uneasily in their stalls. Standing near the main barn, Jack Sullivan, the ranch foreman, adjusted his worn-out leather jacket and pulled his hat lower over his forehead. He had worked on this ranch for over 15 years, and nothing much surprised him anymore. He had seen cattle births in the middle of the night, tornadoes tearing through fences, and even the occasional mountain lion creeping too close to the property. But tonight, there was something different. He couldn't quite place it, but a nagging sense of unease sat heavy in his chest. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was the silence, too much silence. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet. Jack exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached for the flashlight strapped to his belt and flicked it on, casting a beam of light across the dirt path leading toward the fields. That's when he noticed Max, the Parker family's loyal German shepherd, standing at the edge of the fence, his body tense, ears pricked forward. The dog's tail was raised, his muscles coiled as if preparing to spring into action. "What's the matter, boy?" Jack muttered, taking a cautious step toward the dog. Max let out a low growl, his deep brown eyes fixed on something in the distance, just beyond the fence line where the land sloped down toward the tree line. Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Come on now, you hearing things again?" But Max wasn't hearing things, he was listening. And then, suddenly, he bolted. "Max," Jack called, but the dog ignored him completely, sprinting toward the open fields, his powerful legs kicking up dirt as he disappeared into the darkness. Jack cursed under his breath. Max was a smart dog, too smart to just run off like that without a reason. Something was out there. Gripping his flashlight tighter, Jack climbed over the wooden fence and hurried after the dog. The dry grass crunched under his boots as he followed Max's fading silhouette, his own breath growing shallow from the cold air burning his lungs. As he neared the edge of the woods, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick underbrush and the rough bark of the towering oak trees. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled his nostrils. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled whimper. Jack froze, his pulse hammered in his ears. Max was crouched low, his nose close to the ground, his tail wagging slightly, but his stance was protective. Jack stepped closer, and then he saw it. A small wicker basket sat abandoned near the shallow creek, partially covered by a thin, blue blanket. The fabric was damp with dew, and something beneath it shifted weakly. Jack knelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the blanket aside. His breath caught in his throat. Inside the basket, barely larger than a sack of flour, was a baby girl. Her tiny hands were curled into weak fists, her delicate face barely visible beneath a mess of dark curls. She was shivering, her pale skin contrasting sharply with the cold night air. She let out another soft whimper, her lips trembling. Jack felt his stomach tighten. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Max let out a whine, nudging the basket slightly with his nose, as if urging Jack to do something. Jack hesitated for only a second before reaching down and carefully scooping the baby into his arms. She was light as a feather, her little body barely moving as she nestled instinctively into the warmth of his chest. "Who the hell leaves a baby out here?" Jack muttered to himself, cradling her tighter. His mind raced. A newborn abandoned in the woods. This wasn't just neglect. This was intentional. Max stayed close, his ears still perked, eyes darting around the darkness as if expecting someone to return. Jack swallowed hard and turned back toward the ranch. His boots felt heavier with each step. "This ain't right," he murmured to himself. As he reached the fence again, he saw the glow of the ranch house lights, warm and inviting against the night sky. Emily and Richard Parker were still awake. Good, because they needed to see this. Clutching the baby closer, Jack broke into a jog, with Max right by his side. Something told him this night was just the beginning. This first part of the story brings the setting to life with vivid descriptions, tension-building moments, and realistic dialogue. It keeps Texas culture and American realism in mind, while enhancing the emotion of discovering the abandoned baby. Jack's heart pounded as he crossed the open field, cradling the freezing infant against his chest. The baby was barely responsive, her tiny body trembling in his arms, and every instinct in him screamed that she needed warmth immediately. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees behind him, as if whispering warnings of something unseen lurking in the darkness. Max ran beside him, his posture tense, ears flicking back toward the woods as if expecting someone to emerge at any moment. The ranch house came into view, its large wooden structure standing strong against the Texas night. The warm glow of the kitchen lights spilled onto the porch, where the swing creaked faintly in the wind. Jack hurried up the steps, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden planks. Without hesitation, he pushed open the door, letting the warmth of the house wash over him. Inside, Emily Parker stood near the kitchen counter, tying her robe around her waist. Her light brown hair was in a messy bun, and her face was lined with exhaustion from the long day of tending to the ranch. Her husband, Richard Parker, was seated at the table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He was in his late 40s, with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and eyes that had seen years of hard work and struggle. Emily turned at the sound of the door, her eyes widening when she saw Jack holding the baby. "Oh my God," she gasped, rushing forward. "Jack, where did you?" "She was out there," Jack cut in, his voice firm but laced with urgency. "In the woods, near the creek. Someone left her out there to freeze." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the baby, carefully peeling back the damp blanket. The little girl's skin was ice-cold, her breaths weak. Emily pressed a hand against the infant's cheek, her voice shaking. "She's freezing. We have to warm her up now." Richard was already on his feet, his expression shifting from confusion to immediate action. "Get her near the fireplace," he ordered. "Emily, grab some blankets." Jack moved swiftly, stepping into the living room, where the fire crackled in the large stone hearth. He gently lowered the baby onto the soft couch, carefully rubbing her tiny hands between his rough, calloused fingers. Emily returned in seconds, wrapping the infant in thicker, warmer blankets and pressing her close to her chest. Max had followed closely, standing alert beside them, his deep brown eyes locked on the baby. His ears flicked at every sound, his muscles still tense as if he expected danger to come knocking at any moment. "She needs a bottle," Emily said urgently. "Warm milk, anything." "I'll get it," Richard said, moving toward the kitchen. Jack finally exhaled, his pulse still racing. He removed his hat, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "Someone left her out there, Rich. This wasn't an accident. She didn't just crawl out of someone's house. She was put there, in a basket, alone." Emily looked up at him, her face pale. "Oh my God, who would do such a thing?" Richard returned with a bottle of warm milk, and Emily carefully tipped it against the baby's lips. For a moment, there was nothing, no reaction. Then, slowly, the little girl latched onto the bottle and began to suck weakly, her tiny fingers barely twitching. Emily let out a shaky breath. "She's drinking. Thank God." Jack sat back in the armchair, rubbing his hands over his face. "I found this with her," he said after a long pause, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to Richard. Richard unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the single word written inside. "Abigail." Silence fell over the room. "That's her name," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Looks like it," Jack muttered. Richard set the note down on the coffee table, exhaling sharply. "We need to call the sheriff. Someone out there left this child to die. We need to find out who." Jack nodded. "I'll go first thing in the morning." Emily, still holding the baby close, looked down at the tiny bundle in her arms. "Who would do this to a child?" she murmured. "And why?" Jack glanced toward the front door, his mind replaying the eerie quiet of the woods, the distant sound of something, or someone, moving just beyond the trees. He had a feeling they hadn't seen the last of whoever had left Abigail out there, and something told him that the mystery was only just beginning. This chapter is longer and more immersive, with detailed character interactions, emotional weight, and a growing sense of tension. It keeps the realism grounded while adding depth to the characters and the mystery. The fire crackled softly in the living room, casting warm, flickering light over the scene. Emily held Abigail close, still rocking her gently, even though the baby had finally drifted into a fragile sleep. Jack sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, his thoughts tangled in the weight of what had just happened. Richard stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out into the darkness of the ranch as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the tree line. The note with Abigail's name rested on the coffee table, that single word carrying an unsettling weight. It was clear that whoever had left the baby out in the cold hadn't done so in a hurry. The basket had been carefully placed, the blanket tucked around her just enough to suggest that someone had wanted her found, but not before she had suffered through the elements. That alone made Jack's stomach twist. There was intent behind the abandonment, whether it was desperation, fear, or something far worse, he couldn't yet tell. "She's so tiny," Emily murmured, her fingers brushing over Abigail's soft, dark curls. Whoever left her there, they must have been out of options. Jack let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Leaving a baby in the woods in the middle of the night? That's not desperation, Emily. That's something else. Richard finally turned from the window, his jaw tight. "I'll call Sheriff Dawson first thing in the morning. He needs to know about this." "We should call him now," Emily said, looking between the two men. "The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to figure out who did this. Maybe they're still out there." Jack considered that for a moment. There had been something eerie about the woods that night. The silence. The way Max had reacted. He didn't like leaving things to chance, but something in his gut told him that whoever had left Abigail there wasn't planning on coming back for her. Richard exhaled sharply. "It's past midnight. Even if we call now, there's not much he can do until morning." Emily's lips pressed together in frustration, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at the baby in her arms, now warm and safe, and sighed. "She needs a doctor," she murmured. "We need to be sure she's okay, that she wasn't hurt before we found her." Jack's stomach tightened at the thought. The idea that someone might have harmed this tiny girl before abandoning her made his blood simmer. "I can take her first thing," he said. Emily hesitated, clearly torn. "She shouldn't be alone," she said finally. "I'll go with you." Richard nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "All right. First thing in the morning, we'll take her to see Dr. Wallace. After that, we talk to the sheriff." The room fell quiet again, the weight of the situation settling over them like a heavy fog. Max lay at Emily's feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained open, ears twitching at every small sound outside. Jack rubbed his face, exhaustion finally creeping in now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "I'll sleep on the couch," he muttered, "in case anything happens." Richard gave him a long look before nodding. "I'll leave my rifle by the door." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. They all knew that something about this felt unfinished, like a puzzle with missing pieces that were just out of reach. Emily stood carefully, still holding Abigail. "I'll put her in the guest room with me," she said, her voice softer now. "Just for tonight." Jack watched as she disappeared down the hall, the baby bundled tightly in her arms, her small fingers barely visible beneath the blankets. Richard gave one last glance out the window before flipping off the porch light, leaving the ranch in darkness once more. Jack settled onto the couch, boots still on, his hat resting beside him. He didn't expect to sleep much, and as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, he kept his eyes on the front door, waiting for the morning to bring answers, or more questions. The sun barely peeked over the horizon when Jack stirred. He had drifted off at some point, though it was hard to tell when. Max was already up, his ears pricked toward the window, his body tense. Jack sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. Something felt off. Then he heard it, a soft rustling outside, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on gravel. Jack's instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed his hat, swung his boots back onto the floor, and moved toward the window. He barely caught the glimpse of a figure moving near the barn, slipping between the shadows of the fence line. His pulse quickened. "Richard," he said, voice low but firm. From the hallway, Richard appeared, already alert, one hand gripping the shotgun he had set by the door the night before. "What is it?" Jack motioned toward the barn. "Someone's out there." Richard didn't hesitate. He cocked the shotgun, stepping toward the front door. "I'll cover the back. You check the side." Jack nodded, slipping out the front, keeping low as he made his way around the house. The crisp morning air hit his skin, but the tension in his chest kept him warm. He moved carefully, staying close to the side of the barn, listening for any sign of movement. A branch snapped just beyond the fence line. Jack's hand hovered over the knife strapped to his belt, his eyes scanning the field. Whoever it was, they weren't making much effort to stay hidden anymore. That meant one of two things. They were either scared or they wanted to be seen. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. A man, tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his cap. He hesitated when he saw Jack, his body going rigid. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You lost." The man didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the house, eyes darting toward the window where Abigail had slept the night before. Jack's fingers twitched near his belt. "I'll ask you again. You lost." Richard appeared on the other side of the barn, shotgun at the ready. "I'd answer him if I were you." The man took a slow step back, then another, and before either of them could stop him, he turned and bolted into the trees. Jack cursed, sprinting after him, but by the time he reached the edge of the woods, the man was gone. The only thing left behind were his footprints in the dirt. Richard came up beside him, still gripping the gun. "You think that was him?" Jack's jaw tightened. "I think that was somebody who knows exactly why that baby was out here last night." The two men stood in silence, staring at the woods that had swallowed the stranger whole. Whatever was going on, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This chapter expands the tension, deepens the mystery, and brings in the first sign that someone is watching the ranch. The stranger's presence adds a sense of urgency and danger to the situation, making it clear that Abigail wasn't abandoned by accident. The sun was creeping higher over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in muted shades of gold and pink, but the tension at Redwood Ranch was anything but peaceful. Jack stood at the edge of the tree line, his pulse still hammering from the chase. The stranger was gone, swallowed by the dense woods, but his presence lingered like a ghost in the morning air. Whoever he was, he hadn't stumbled onto the ranch by accident. He had been watching, and he had seen Abigail. Jack turned to Richard, who still had his shotgun at the ready, scanning the trees. "We should have caught him," Richard muttered, voice tight with frustration. "Damn bastard was fast." Jack exhaled slowly, glancing back toward the house. "He didn't run till he saw us," he said. "Means he wasn't just passing through. He was waiting for something." Richard frowned, following Jack's gaze toward the house where Emily was inside with Abigail, completely unaware of what had just happened. Jack set his jaw. "We need to tell the sheriff. Now." They moved quickly, heading back to the house. When they stepped inside, Emily was in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, her face still carrying the exhaustion of the long night. She looked up at them, instantly sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting her cup down. Richard didn't waste time. "Someone was out by the barn. A man. Jack saw him first. When we confronted him, he ran into the woods." Emily's face paled. "Someone was watching us." Her arms instinctively wrapped tighter around her body. "Oh my God, you think it has something to do with Abigail?" Jack pulled out a chair and sat down, rubbing his hands together, still feeling the morning chill. "I don't think it's a coincidence," he admitted. "Whoever left her out there last night, it's possible they're not done with her. Maybe they regret leaving her, or maybe they were making sure no one found her alive." Emily sucked in a sharp breath. "You mean you think they wanted her to?" "I don't know." Jack cut in, not wanting to say the words. The idea was too sick to even finish the thought. Richard grabbed his keys off the counter. "I'm calling Dawson," he said, already heading toward the landline on the wall. The Willow Creek Sheriff's Department wasn't big. It handled mostly farm disputes, the occasional robbery, and bar fights at the only tavern in town. But this was something else entirely. Emily sat down heavily in the chair across from Jack. "She's just a baby," she whispered, looking toward the living room, where Abigail was sleeping soundly in a nest of blankets. Who could do this? Jack had no answer. 15 minutes later, the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached their ears, followed by the distant hum of an engine. Jack stood, moving to the window, just as a black and white sheriff's cruiser pulled up in front of the house. The door swung open, and Sheriff Tom Dawson stepped out, adjusting his belt. Dawson was in his late 50s, with graying hair beneath his hat and a weathered face that had seen too many years of small-town troubles. He was a fair man, but he took his job seriously, and he had little patience for nonsense. Jack and Richard stepped onto the porch as Dawson made his way toward them. "Heard you boys got yourselves a situation," the sheriff said, glancing between them. Richard nodded. "You could say that." Dawson exhaled, looking toward the barn. "All right, start from the beginning." They told him everything. The abandoned baby, the note, the man they had seen watching the house that morning. Dawson listened without interrupting, his sharp eyes flicking toward the tree line as they described the chase. When they finished, he let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a mess," he muttered. Jack folded his arms. "We need to find out who that man was. And more importantly, who left Abigail out there." Dawson nodded, shifting his weight. "First things first, I'll get a deputy to patrol the area, see if we catch anyone lurking around again. In the meantime, I'll run the baby's description through CPS and missing persons. Might take some time, but if there's a mother out there looking for her, we'll find out." Jack's jaw tightened. "And if there isn't?" Dawson met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then we have a whole different problem, don't we?" Inside, Emily was standing by the window, her arms wrapped protectively around herself as she watched the men talk. She barely noticed when Abigail stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft, sleepy sigh. Whoever had left her there had done so on purpose. And now someone was watching, waiting. And Emily had the terrible feeling that this wasn't over. Hours later, Jack found himself back in town, sitting in one of the chairs in Sheriff Dawson's office as the man shuffled through files and reports, occasionally jotting notes onto a notepad. The office smelled of old paper and stale coffee, and the low murmur of a police scanner buzzed in the background. Dawson sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Nothing so far," he muttered, glancing up at Jack. "No missing person reports matching her description. No babies reported lost or taken in the surrounding counties. She's a ghost." Jack exhaled slowly. That wasn't good news. "Could be she was never reported missing," Dawson continued. "Could be someone wanted her off the books." Jack frowned. "Off the books?" The sheriff gave him a long, measured look. "Adoptions don't always happen legally, Jack. Babies get passed around. No papers, no records. A woman who doesn't want her child? She finds someone willing to take them. No questions asked." Jack's stomach turned. "You think Abigail was supposed to go to someone else?" "I don't know," Dawson admitted. "But what I do know is that someone went through the trouble of leaving her somewhere she'd either be found or wouldn't." Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And the man this morning?" Dawson shook his head. "No ID, no leads. Just footprints and a whole lot of questions." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "So what now?" Dawson looked at him seriously. "Now? You keep your eyes open. If that man comes back, you let me know. And Jack." Jack met his gaze. The sheriff's expression darkened. "If someone wanted that baby gone once, they might try again." Jack swallowed hard. The weight of that realization settled deep in his chest. Back at the ranch, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Emily sat by the fireplace, Abigail cradled in her arms, unaware that outside, just beyond the tree line, someone was watching. And this time, they weren't leaving. This chapter intensifies the mystery, deepens the investigation, and raises the stakes with the first signs that Abigail's presence at the ranch is more dangerous than they realized. It also sets up the looming threat of whoever is watching. The evening settled heavily over Redwood Ranch, the golden hues of the Texas sunset slowly giving way to the dark blues and purples of night. The land stretched out in endless shadows, the distant tree lines standing like silent sentinels. The air had turned crisp, a biting chill creeping in as the wind whispered through the fields. Inside the house, the warmth of the crackling fireplace provided a stark contrast to the unease that had taken root in the Parker household. Emily sat on the couch, holding Abigail close, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing over the baby's soft curls. The little girl had fallen asleep again, her tiny breaths rhythmic and steady. Emily hadn't been able to stop thinking about the man Jack and Richard had seen near the barn that morning. The idea that someone was watching them, possibly waiting for the right moment to take Abigail back, or worse, made her stomach twist. Jack leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his face lined with the weight of the day's events. Richard stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse outside. Max lay near the door, ears twitching at every sound, his body alert despite his outwardly calm posture. She shouldn't be here. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked up. What are you saying? Emily exhaled sharply, shifting Abigail slightly in her arms. I mean, she's not safe here. Not with some stranger lurking around. What if they try to break in? What if they take her while we're sleeping? Jack pushed off the counter, running a hand over his face. And where exactly do you think she'll be safer? We take her to CPS, hand her over to some foster system where she might get lost in the cracks? You really think whoever left her out there is just going to stop looking? Emily clenched her jaw. I don't know, Jack. I just know that if something happens to her. She looked down at Abigail, brushing a protective hand over the baby's tiny fingers. I won't forgive myself. Richard turned from the window. We called the sheriff. We did the right thing. But until we know who that man was and what he wanted, we need to be ready. Jack sighed. So what? We sit here, guns at the door, waiting for trouble? Richard's expression hardened. If that's what it takes. The room fell into tense silence. Then, a loud knock at the front door. Everyone froze. Even Max, who had been lying still moments before, was suddenly on his feet, his body tense, a deep, guttural growl rumbling from his chest. Jack reached for his gun on the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. Richard stepped toward the door, but didn't open it. Instead, he called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Jack exchanged a wary glance with Emily, who instinctively held Abigail closer. Then, another knock. This time, slower, more deliberate. Richard's fingers tightened around the doorknob. I asked you a question. A voice finally responded, low, hoarse, almost hesitant. I just want to talk. Jack stepped closer, gun in hand. Talk about what? The man on the other side hesitated. Then, the baby. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Jack didn't waste another second. He yanked the door open, gun raised. The porch light flickered, casting a dim glow over the figure standing there. The man was thin, his skin pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His dark hoodie was damp with sweat, his jeans caked in dried mud. His hands were raised slightly, a cautious gesture of surrender. But his eyes went straight to Abigail. Jack stepped forward, blocking his view. Who the hell are you? The man swallowed hard, shifting nervously. My name's Evan, he muttered. And I need to know if she's okay. Richard narrowed his eyes. You the one that left her out there? Evan's jaw tensed. No, he said quickly. But I know who did. Silence hung heavy in the air. Emily stepped forward, her voice barely steady. Who? Evan's gaze flickered to her, then back to Jack. I ain't saying a word till I know she's all right. Jack didn't move for a long moment. His instincts screamed at him to be careful. This man wasn't just some innocent bystander. But he also knew they wouldn't get any answers standing there with a gun in his face. Finally, he lowered the barrel slightly. She's alive, he said. Now start talking. Evan exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly in relief. He glanced toward the trees before stepping up onto the porch, lowering his voice. Look, I don't got a lot of time. The people who left her out there, they ain't good people. And if they find out she's still here, they'll come back. Jack's grip on the gun tightened. Who are they? Evan hesitated. I can't. Jack took a step closer. Try again. Evan swallowed hard, looking down. I worked for him, he admitted. Not by choice, but you don't say no to these people. They run things quiet, under the radar. And when they got a problem they don't want to deal with, they make it disappear. Emily's arms tightened around Abigail. Are you saying they were trying to get rid of her? Evan met her gaze. They were supposed to, he said. But someone changed their mind last minute. Told me to leave her somewhere she'd be found. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Who? Evan hesitated again, then shook his head. I can't say. Jack's patience snapped. He grabbed Evan by the front of his hoodie, shoving him against the porch railing. You don't get to walk up here, tell us some half-assed story, and expect to leave in one piece, he growled. Who? Left. The baby. Evan's breath hitched, his eyes darting toward the road. I ain't the only one watching this place, he whispered. They know I'm here. If I talk, I'm dead. Jack's grip didn't loosen. If you don't, you're dead anyway. A car engine roared to life somewhere down the road, headlights flashing briefly through the trees before speeding off into the night. Evan flinched, shoving Jack off him. They know, he hissed. I gotta go. Jack reached for him, but Evan was already running, his figure disappearing into the darkness as fast as it had appeared. Richard cursed, lowering his shotgun. Emily's face had gone white, her arms still wrapped protectively around Abigail. Jack clenched his jaw, staring after Evan, his mind racing. The men who left Abigail out there weren't just strangers. They were dangerous. And now, they knew exactly where to look. This chapter ramps up the tension, introduces Evan as a reluctant informant, and confirms that Abigail's abandonment wasn't just a desperate act. It was a cover-up for something far worse. It also establishes the imminent threat of the people watching the ranch. The roar of the car engine faded into the distance, swallowed by the endless stretch of Texas night, but the tension it left behind remained thick in the air. Jack stood motionless on the porch, eyes fixed on the spot where Evan had disappeared, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. They knew. Whoever had left Abigail out there, whoever had planned for her to vanish, they knew she was still alive. And now, they had been warned that the people at Redwood Ranch weren't going to just let her go. Behind him, Richard slowly lowered his shotgun, his grip still tight around the barrel. This just got a whole lot worse, he muttered, his voice rough with controlled anger. Jack finally turned back toward the house, stepping inside without a word. Emily was still standing by the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around Abigail as if she could shield the baby from whatever unseen danger had just been unleashed. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she rocked the child instinctively. Max, who had been watching the entire exchange from the doorway, let out a low, anxious whine, pacing near Emily's feet. He could sense it too. Something was coming. Richard followed Jack inside, locking the door behind him before setting his shotgun against the wall. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That bastard didn't tell us anything we can actually use, he grumbled. All we know is that some bad people wanted this baby gone, and now they know we have her. Jack ran a hand through his hair, pacing near the kitchen table. He gave us more than you think, he said. First off, he confirmed she wasn't just abandoned. She was meant to disappear. That means this isn't some young mother who panicked and left her baby behind. This is something bigger. Emily clutched Abigail tighter. But why? She asked, her voice shaking. What could a baby possibly have to do with something this dangerous? Jack met her gaze, and for the first time that night, he didn't have an answer. Richard sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, rubbing a hand over his face. We need to make a decision, he said, his voice low and serious. Dawson needs to know about this. But even if we tell him, what's he gonna do? We're not talking about some small-time criminals. If they wanted Abigail dead, they'd have made damn sure she was. Emily flinched at his words, holding the baby protectively against her chest. So what are you saying? She whispered. Jack sighed, bracing his hands against the table. He's saying we might not be able to trust the law to fix this, he muttered. Not if these people have power. Richard nodded grimly. And if that's the case, we're on our own. Silence hung over the room, the weight of reality settling in. Emily looked down at Abigail, then back at the two men. So what do we do? Jack straightened, his mind already working through the possibilities. First thing in the morning, I'm reinforcing every lock on this house. We don't leave Abigail alone for a second. Richard, you still got that old rifle scope? Richard nodded slowly. Yeah. What? Jack's expression darkened. Because I want to know if someone's watching this house. Emily swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the baby's blanket. And what if they come back? Jack looked at her, his voice steady. Then we make damn sure they don't leave. Morning came faster than any of them would have liked. Jack had barely slept, keeping watch from the window, his rifle resting on the table beside him. The sun cast a dull, golden glow over the ranch, but the beauty of the morning felt tainted by the unease that had settled over the household. Richard had already been outside, walking the perimeter, checking for anything unusual. When he came back in, his expression was tense. Tracks, he muttered, tossing his hat onto the table. Someone was out by the tree line last night. They didn't come up to the house, but they were watching. Emily, who had just finished feeding Abigail, stiffened. Are you sure? Richard gave her a tired look. Tracks don't lie. Jack exhaled through his nose, standing. Then it's only a matter of time before they get bold enough to come closer. He glanced at Abigail, who was curled up in Emily's arms, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her. We need to be ahead of them. Richard nodded. I'll head into town, see what I can dig up. Maybe someone's heard something. Jack grabbed his coat. I'm coming with you. Emily's eyes widened. And what about us? You're just gonna leave us here alone. Jack stopped, his face softening slightly. You won't be alone, he assured her. Max stays with you. And you keep a gun close, understand? Emily hesitated, but eventually, she nodded. Jack and Richard didn't waste time. They took the truck, heading toward Willow Creek, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone, but big enough to have its fair share of secrets. When they pulled up in front of Dawson's office, the sheriff was already outside, drinking coffee from a worn-out thermos. He squinted as they approached, his face unreadable. You boys look like hell, he greeted, lowering the cup. Jack didn't bother with pleasantries. That man from last night. He came back. Dawson's brow furrowed. What? Richard folded his arms. Said he worked for the people who left Abigail. Said they'd be coming back. Dawson cursed under his breath, running a hand through his graying hair. This just keeps getting better. Jack's jaw tightened. We need to know who the hell these people are. Fast. Dawson exhaled, nodding toward the office. Come inside. I might have something. The sheriff's office smelled like old leather and coffee, the walls lined with wanted posters and case files. Dawson moved to his desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a thin manila folder. Did some digging after you left yesterday, he muttered, flipping it open. You were right. No missing reports matching Abigail's description. But I did find something else. Jack and Richard leaned in as Dawson slid a grainy, black and white mugshot across the desk. The man in the photo had sharp cheekbones, hollow eyes, and a dead expression. Jack's stomach dropped. It was Evan. His real name's Evan Grayson, Dawson said. Small-time crook. Been in and out of trouble for years. Drug running, car theft, assault. Got ties to a few people he shouldn't. Jack's fingers curled into fists. Like who? Dawson hesitated, then pulled another folder. This time, he slid out a newspaper clipping. The headline made Jack's blood run cold. Federal investigation targets underground human trafficking ring. He looked up sharply. You're telling me these people? Dawson nodded grimly. They don't just deal in stolen cars and drugs. They deal in people. Richard swore under his breath. Jack felt his pulse pounding in his ears. If that was true, if Abigail had been in their hands, then someone had saved her at the last second. And whoever that was, they were running out of time. Jack pushed back from the desk, jaw tight. We need to move. Now. Because if these people wanted Abigail gone before, now they'd be desperate. And desperate people did dangerous things. Jack felt his grip tighten on the edge of Dawson's desk, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the newspaper clipping in front of him. The words burned into his mind. Human trafficking. The thought of Abigail, this tiny, helpless baby, being caught up in something so sick, so monstrous, made his stomach turn. Richard leaned forward, tapping the grainy mugshot of Evan Grayson with a calloused finger. You're telling me this son of a bitch has ties to a trafficking ring? Dawson nodded grimly, rubbing his temple. Not just ties. He worked for them. Nothing high up, from what I can tell, just a small-time runner. But that's the thing about these operations. The guys at the bottom don't know much, and the ones at the top? Ghosts. They keep their tracks clean. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. If this baby was in their hands, someone on the inside made a dangerous call by letting her go. Jack felt a cold realization settle over him. And now they want to fix that mistake. Dawson met his gaze, his expression tight. Exactly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The low hum of the police scanner buzzed in the background, the sound of a truck rolling past outside breaking the silence. Jack forced himself to breathe through the rising anger boiling inside him. Richard let out a slow exhale, scratching his graying beard. So what's our move? Dawson hesitated. We could put in a formal report, get the feds involved. But with a case like this, they'll take their time. Maybe they'll dig something up, maybe they won't. These people don't leave loose ends. Jack clenched his jaw. And what if they come back before the feds do? Dawson's silence was answer enough. Jack pushed back from the desk. We can't wait. We need to get her out of here. Richard's brows furrowed. And take her where? Jack didn't have an answer, but Emily did. Back at the ranch, Emily sat in the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around Abigail as she listened to the wind whip against the windows. The house had never felt so fragile. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel safe here. She felt hunted. Max lay at her feet, ears twitching at every sound. The German Shepherd had been restless since last night, pacing the house, his instincts sharper than ever. Emily wasn't sure if she should be comforted or more afraid. The door swung open, making her jump. Jack and Richard strode in, their faces set like stone. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack glanced at Abigail, still wrapped in her blankets, completely unaware of the storm closing in around her. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "We need to leave," he said. Emily's stomach tightened. "Leave? Jack, this is our home." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not safe anymore." Emily shook her head, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Where would we even go?" Jack exhaled through his nose, thinking. They needed somewhere far enough that no one would expect, but close enough to move fast. Then it hit him. "My uncle's cabin," he said suddenly. Richard frowned. "Out by the lake." Jack nodded. "It's remote, off the grid. No one would think to look there. We take her, stay low, and figure out our next move." Emily hesitated, looking down at Abigail. The idea of running, of uprooting their lives in an instant, terrified her. But the thought of staying here, waiting for these people to come knocking, was worse. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Jack's shoulders eased slightly. "We move now? Pack only what we need." Richard was already heading toward the back room to grab supplies. Emily stood, her arms tightening around Abigail. "Jack," she said, her voice barely steady. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" Jack met her eyes, and for the first time, he let the truth show. "I don't think they ever left." The night air was thick with tension as Jack loaded the last of the bags into the back of the truck. Emily climbed into the passenger seat, Abigail bundled against her chest, while Richard slid into the back. Max jumped up beside him, his body tense, ears still flicking at every sound. Jack took a slow breath, gripping the wheel. "We keep to the back roads. No stopping." Richard nodded. "Let's move." Jack put the truck in gear and rolled out onto the long dirt road leading away from the ranch. The headlights carved through the darkness, the trees looming like silent sentries on either side. 15 minutes in, the road remained empty. Just open fields and stretches of nothingness. Jack kept his grip tight on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few minutes. Then Max growled. Jack's pulse spiked. He glanced in the mirror again. This time, his blood went cold. Headlights. Far behind them, barely visible through the dust cloud their truck was kicking up. But they were there, and they were getting closer. Emily noticed his tension instantly. "Jack." Jack's voice was tight. "We've got company." Richard turned, cursing under his breath. How the hell did they find us? Jack's mind raced. They must have been watching the house, waiting for them to make a move. The headlights grew brighter. Closer. Then the car sped up. Jack swerved off the main road, cutting onto an unpaved path leading toward the backwoods. The truck bounced violently over the uneven dirt, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. Emily let out a small gasp as she held onto Abigail, shielding the baby from the rough ride. The car behind them followed. Richard pulled out his shotgun, rolling down the window. "If they get any closer, I'll put a hole in their damn radiator." Jack gritted his teeth. "Hold on." He spotted an old wooden bridge ahead, barely stable, but it was their only shot. If they made it across, they could cut through the woods toward the lake. He slammed the gas. The truck thundered onto the bridge, the old wooden planks groaning beneath the weight. The car behind them tried to follow, but Jack yanked the wheel hard to the left, clipping the side of the bridge railing just enough to send a shower of splintered wood behind them. The car skidded, its tires screeching as the driver tried to regain control. Then the bridge collapsed. The sound of splintering wood and metal filled the night as the pursuing car plunged into the ravine below. The headlights flickered once, twice, then went dark. Jack didn't stop. He kept driving, his hands like steel on the wheel, not daring to look back. Emily was trembling, her breath ragged. "Are they?" Richard exhaled. "They're not following us anymore." Jack kept his eyes forward, adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now, they had bought themselves time. And time was the only thing keeping Abigail alive. This chapter escalates the tension, introduces a high-speed chase, and forces the family into a dangerous escape, proving that the people after Abigail aren't backing down. The stakes are now life or death. The truck rumbled down the winding dirt road, headlights cutting through the dense Texas night. Dust and debris clung to the vehicle like remnants of the chaos they had just escaped. Jack's hands were locked onto the wheel, his knuckles white, heart still hammering in his chest. Every muscle in his body remained coiled, every nerve on edge. They had shaken off their pursuers, for now. But Jack knew better than to think they were safe. Emily was in the passenger seat, her breathing uneven as she cradled Abigail tightly against her chest. The baby had somehow slept through the entire ordeal, her tiny face nestled into the crook of Emily's arm. Richard sat in the back seat, still gripping his shotgun, his jaw set in a hard line. Max was beside him, shifting uneasily, his ears flicking at every distant sound outside. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened clung to the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Jack kept his eyes on the road, his voice low and steady. "The cabin. It's another 15 miles from here. Off-grid, no power lines, no neighbors for miles. No one will find us there." Emily exhaled shakily, adjusting Abigail's blanket. "And then what? We just hide forever." Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. "No. We figure out who these people are. We find a way to stop them." Richard let out a slow breath, glancing out the back window. "I hate to break it to you, but these aren't the kind of people you just stop, Jack." His voice was gruff, edged with something dark. "They don't leave loose ends. And right now, we're a damn loose end." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. They all knew it was true. They drove in silence for the next stretch of road, the cabin looming somewhere in the distance, tucked deep into the woods beyond the reach of civilization. Jack had only been there a handful of times. His uncle had built it decades ago as a hunting retreat, though it had been largely abandoned since his passing. It wasn't much, a small wooden structure, a fireplace, an old well for water, but it would be enough. For now, when they finally pulled up, the headlights illuminated the outline of the cabin, standing small and isolated beneath the endless sky. Jack killed the engine, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Richard climbed out first, shotgun still in hand, his sharp eyes scanning the tree-line. Jack followed, listening to the way the wind whistled through the trees, how the branches swayed but didn't snap, how the night was too quiet. Max hopped out of the truck, sniffing the air, his posture rigid. He let out a low growl, not quite a warning, but enough to make Jack tense. Emily stayed inside, holding Abigail close. "Jack," she whispered, "what if they find us here?" Jack turned back, his expression unreadable. "Then we're ready for them." He grabbed the bags from the truck, handing one to Richard, who immediately headed inside to check the place over. Jack helped Emily out, keeping an arm around her shoulder as they hurried toward the cabin. The wooden steps creaked under their weight, the old door groaning as it swung open. Inside, dust coated every surface, the scent of aged wood thick in the air. The fireplace sat unused in the corner, the furniture covered in white sheets. It was cold, but at least it was safe. For now, Richard moved through the space quickly, checking the back rooms, the single bathroom, the back door. "All clear," he muttered. Jack nodded. "We keep the lights low, stay quiet. Max keeps watch." Emily sat down on the old couch, pulling the blanket tighter around Abigail. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she whispered. This is insane." Jack crouched in front of her, his voice softer now. "I know, but we'll get through it." Emily met his eyes, searching for reassurance. "You really believe that?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Before Emily could say more, Max growled again, louder this time. Jack and Richard snapped to attention. The dog was at the door, his body rigid, his head low, his ears pricked forward. Richard moved to the window, peering out. His expression darkened. "We've got headlights." Jack was already reaching for his rifle. "How far?" Richard squinted. "Half a mile out." Moving slow. Jack's jaw tightened. They had found them. Emily's breath caught. "What do we do?" Jack stood, eyes locked on Richard. "We make sure they don't get any closer." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the distant rumble of the approaching vehicle. Jack and Richard moved quickly but silently, positioning themselves near the door. The headlights grew brighter, cutting through the darkness. A sleek black SUV, the kind that screamed money and power, rolled to a slow stop just beyond the tree-line. The engine hummed, but no one stepped out. Max's growl deepened. Jack lifted his rifle, the barrel steady. Richard kept his shotgun close, his jaw clenched. "They're waiting," he muttered, "trying to see if we'll make the first move." Jack wasn't about to give them that advantage. Instead, he raised his voice, firm and sharp. "This is private property. You got 5 seconds to turn around before we put some holes in that car." Silence. Then, the back door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. Even from this distance, Jack could tell he was calm, controlled, not the kind of guy who panicked easily. The kind of guy who didn't need to. He lifted his hands slightly in a mock gesture of peace. "No need for that," he called, his voice smooth, practiced. "We just want to talk." Jack didn't lower the gun. "Funny, that's what the last guy said." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Evan's a coward." "I'm not." Richard took a step forward. "Then what the hell do you want?" The man exhaled slowly. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Jack felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't asking about the truck or the land. He was talking about Abigail. Jack adjusted his grip on the rifle. "She's not yours either." The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "That's where you're wrong." Silence stretched between them. Then, the man took another step forward. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he said. "Just hand over the girl, and we'll forget this ever happened." Jack's voice was like steel. "Not a chance in hell." The man sighed, a slow, patient sound. Then, he turned his head slightly, and more car doors opened. Jack's pulse spiked. 2 more men stepped out, both armed. Jack's fingers curled tighter around the trigger. Richard lifted his shotgun. "Looks like we've got ourselves a problem." The man smiled coldly. "No," he said softly. "You've got yourselves a war." This chapter brings the threat directly to the doorstep, introducing a new and more dangerous player who isn't interested in negotiations. Now, Jack and his family are outgunned, outnumbered, and facing a fight they might not walk away from. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears as he locked eyes with the man standing in front of the black SUV. He could feel the weight of the rifle in his hands, steady but tense, his body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. Richard stood beside him, shotgun aimed, his stance rigid, his face carved in stone. Inside the cabin, Emily sat frozen, her arms wrapped protectively around Abigail, as if sheer willpower could shield the baby from whatever nightmare was about to unfold. The man in the dark coat took another step forward, his movements slow, deliberate, controlled. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't afraid. He was a man who had done this before. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice smooth, almost bored. Jack didn't lower his rifle. "That's funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." The man's lips twitched, almost amused. He glanced toward his men, 2 well-built guys in dark clothes, standing near the SUV, both armed, both waiting. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," the man said, tilting his head slightly. "This isn't your fight. Hand over the girl, and you walk away. No harm. No consequences." Jack's jaw tightened. "See, that's where we've got a problem." He adjusted his stance slightly, finger hovering near the trigger. "Because the second you left that baby out in the woods, she became my fight." The man exhaled slowly, as if mildly disappointed. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Richard finally spoke, his voice low and filled with gravel and fire. "You expect us to be reasonable while you're standing on our land, armed, trying to take a baby?" He took a step forward, the barrel of his shotgun now aimed directly at the man's chest. "I don't know how things work in whatever hellhole you crawled out of, but out here, a man doesn't let a child get hurt." Silence. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the branches overhead. Max let out a deep, warning growl, his muscles tensed, eyes locked onto the intruders. The man in the coat sighed, rubbing his temple. "I was trying to be polite." Then he flicked his fingers. The first gunshot exploded through the night. Jack barely had time to react before he saw the muzzle flash from one of the men near the SUV. He dove sideways, rolling into the dirt as the bullet shattered the porch railing. Richard fired back, his shotgun roaring, sending splinters flying into the air. Max lunged forward, teeth bared, a snarl ripping from his throat as he charged toward the nearest man. Jack hit the ground hard, but he didn't stop moving. He swung his rifle up, lining up the sights just as one of the men raised his gun again. Bang. Jack's shot found its mark. The man stumbled back with a shouted curse, dropping his weapon as he clutched his bleeding arm. Richard fired again, hitting the SUV's front tire, sending the vehicle sinking to one side. The man in the coat didn't flinch. He simply stepped back, his expression still eerily calm, as if he were observing a chess game unfold in real time. "Enough," he called, his voice sharp as a blade. His men hesitated. One of them was already injured. The other, now pinned behind the car, held his gun tight, waiting for an opening. Jack pushed himself up, breathing hard, his rifle still aimed. "You still want to talk?" he growled. The man chuckled. Jack felt his blood go cold. "You're good," the man admitted. "I can see why Evan thought you might be a problem." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. "Where is he?" The man gave him a slow, knowing smirk. "Let's just say, he won't be talking to you again." Jack felt the implication hit him like a punch to the gut. Evan was dead. That meant the only lead they had was gone. Emily's voice suddenly cut through the night. Sharp, desperate. "Jack!" Jack turned toward the cabin, his heart seizing in his chest. The back door was open, and Abigail was gone. Panic slammed through Jack's body like a lightning strike. His mind barely had time to register what was happening before his legs were already moving. Someone had gone through the back. Someone had been waiting. Jack sprinted toward the open door, nearly shoving past Emily as he barreled inside. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with panic. Emily was trembling, her hands clutching at her chest. I don't know. I had her right here." Richard was right behind him, his shotgun still smoking from the last shot. "They must have sent someone around while we were distracted," he said, his face pale with rage. Max bolted through the door, nose to the ground, sniffing wildly. Then, suddenly, he took off. Jack didn't hesitate. He ran. The woods behind the cabin were thick, the darkness swallowing everything in its grasp. But Jack didn't care. He could hear the footsteps ahead. Someone was running. Fast. Max was ahead of him, weaving through the trees, snarling as he chased after the scent. Jack gritted his teeth, pushing harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. Then he heard it. A baby's cry. A surge of adrenaline nearly knocked him sideways. She was close. The footsteps ahead suddenly skidded, the sound of someone stumbling over roots. Jack closed the distance, his breath ragged as he caught the faintest outline of a figure in the darkness. A man. Carrying Abigail. Jack didn't think. He tackled the bastard full force, sending them both crashing into the ground. Abigail screamed, her tiny voice piercing through the night as she was thrown from the man's grasp. Jack twisted mid-fall, lunging for her, arms outstretched. His hands caught her just before she hit the ground. He rolled, absorbing the impact, pulling her tightly against his chest, shielding her with his body. She was safe, but the man, whoever he was already scrambling to his feet. Jack barely had time to react before he saw the flash of a knife. The blade swung toward him, gleaming in the moonlight. Jack ducked, twisting just in time to avoid the strike. He shoved Abigail into the crook of his arm, reaching for his gun, but before he could draw it, Max launched himself forward. The dog hit the man like a freight train, knocking him backward with a vicious snarl. The attacker screamed, the knife falling from his hand as Max sank his teeth into his arm, dragging him down. Jack didn't hesitate. He shifted Abigail against his chest and stood, his gun finally free. He aimed it directly at the man's head. "Don't move," Jack growled. The man, bleeding and pinned beneath Max, let out a sharp, pained laugh. "You have no idea what you're involved in," he hissed. Jack's jaw clenched. "I know enough." Richard burst through the trees, shotgun raised. "You got him." Jack nodded, heart still pounding. Then, for the first time, fear flickered in the man's eyes. Not because of the gun, not because of Max, but because of something else. Jack narrowed his eyes. "What the hell are you so afraid of?" The man's breath hitched. He shook his head. "They're coming." Jack's stomach dropped. And then, in the distance, far beyond the trees, came the sound of more engines. The sound of approaching engines rumbled through the night, low and menacing, growing louder with every second. Jack felt his pulse slam against his ribs, his body still thrumming with the adrenaline of the chase. Abigail whimpered against his chest, her tiny fists gripping his shirt, her fear as raw as his own. Richard stood beside him, shotgun locked and ready, his breathing controlled but tense. Max remained pinning the attacker to the ground, his teeth still sunk deep into the man's arm, a low, menacing growl rattling from his chest. But none of them missed the shift in the air. The fear in the attacker's eyes wasn't for them. It was for whoever was coming next. Jack adjusted his grip on his rifle. "How many?" he demanded, his voice steady but cold. The man beneath Max coughed, wincing at the pressure of the dog's jaw against his flesh. "You think this ends with me?" he spat, blood dripping from his lip. "You're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Jack's jaw clenched. "I'll take my chances." Then he heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. The vehicle stopped, just beyond the clearing. The headlights flooded the tree line, casting long, twisted shadows across the underbrush. Jack stepped back, placing himself between the lights and Emily, who had just reached them, Abigail still in her arms, her face pale with terror. Richard exhaled through his nose. "This ain't gonna be pretty." Jack nodded once. "No, it ain't." Then, the doors opened. One by one, figures stepped out, silhouettes cutting through the fog of dust kicked up by the tires. 4 men, maybe more behind them. And then him, the man from before, the one in the dark coat, the one who hadn't been afraid. His expression was calm, almost amused, as he adjusted his sleeves, stepping forward. "Well," he drawled, "I was hoping we could handle this without all the theatrics." Jack lifted his rifle. Too late. The man sighed, shaking his head as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Jack tilted his head slightly. "You seem to be under the impression that I give a damn." A slow, knowing smile curved the man's lips. "You should." Jack's grip on his rifle didn't waver. "Last chance. Get in your cars. Drive away." The man chuckled softly. "Or what?" Jack's voice was quiet, deadly. "Or we start putting bodies in the dirt." Silence. For a moment, no one moved. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of a coyote's cry. Jack's trigger finger twitched, the weight of the moment pressing against him like a vice. Then, the man in the coat smile faded. "That baby," he said, his voice like silk over steel, "doesn't belong to you." Jack's muscles coiled. "She doesn't belong to you either." A flicker of something cold passed through the man's eyes. "You're making a mistake." Jack exhaled slowly. "No, the mistake was yours. Leaving her out there, thinking no one would care enough to stop you." The man studied him for a long moment. Then, without looking away, he lifted his hand. His men drew their weapons. Jack didn't hesitate. Bang! The first shot tore through the silence, shattering the standoff. Richard fired his shotgun, the blast knocking one of the gunmen off his feet, his body slamming into the dirt with a sharp, broken cry. Jack moved fast, dragging Emily down behind a fallen log, shielding Abigail with his body. Max lunged, his massive form slamming into another attacker, sending them both crashing into the ground. Bullets ripped through the trees, bark splintering, the echoes of gunfire rolling across the open land. Jack aimed, fired. One shot, center mass. Another man went down hard, his weapon flying from his grasp. Richard reloaded, stepping forward, firing again, forcing the remaining men to scramble for cover behind their vehicles. Then, suddenly, silence. Smoke curled in the air. The scent of gunpowder and dirt filled Jack's lungs. The man in the coat hadn't moved. Not once. Jack's rifle was still trained on him, finger hovering over the trigger, ready to end this once and for all. But the man just stood there, his expression unchanged, as if none of this mattered. Then he smiled. A slow, measured thing. Jack felt the shift before the words even came. "This isn't over," the man said quietly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. His remaining men hesitated, their fingers twitching on their triggers, but none of them dared to act without his command. The doors slammed shut. The engines roared to life. Jack watched, heart still hammering, as the vehicles reversed, tires kicking up dust, then sped off into the night, leaving behind only the dead. Epilogue. The road ahead. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle still in hand, his muscles still tense, waiting for something more. But it didn't come. Richard exhaled sharply, lowering his shotgun. "Well, that was a hell of a thing." Jack let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Emily was still crouched behind the log. Abigail clutched tightly against her chest, silent tears streaking her face. Jack knelt beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. Emily looked at him, her eyes wide, uncertain. "Is it?" Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but they won't be back tonight." She swallowed hard, nodding. Max whined softly, sniffing at Abigail, his tail wagging slightly as if making sure she was okay. Jack looked at Richard. "We can't stay here." Richard nodded. "Agreed. Dawson would have to hear about this. The bodies would have to be dealt with. There would be questions, investigations, but Jack had no illusions. Men like the one in the coat didn't disappear just because they lost a fight. They would regroup. They would come back. But next time, Jack would be ready." Emily looked down at Abigail, brushing her tiny curls with shaking fingers. "What happens to her now?" Jack met her gaze, and for the first time, the answer was clear. "She stays with us." Emily's breath caught, but she didn't argue, because somehow, in the middle of all this chaos, this tiny, innocent girl had become theirs. No matter what happened next, Jack adjusted his grip on his rifle, looking one last time at the dark road ahead. No matter who came for her, Abigail had a family now, and no one was ever taking her away again. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until now, comment, "I watched until here," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.